Ours, Apollo, through a series of maneuvers, will slowly close the orbital gap with Soyuz. The two crews will meet again, not as members of this or that nationality, but as friends who for 3 years shared their separate cultures and customs and a part of themselves.
At the peak of the Cold War in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite known as Sputnik into space, heightening their already strained relations with the United States. This launch marked the beginning of an important political conflict of the Cold War, referred to as the space race. Each nation fought to prove their technological and intellectual superiority over one another through new advancements in space, such as landing on the moon. After a series of prolonged negotiations, their long-lived rivalry began to diminish, leading to the compromise of the conjoined Apollo-Soyuz project that would pave future collaborated advances that have progressed scientific discovery in space. During the period after World War II, the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union intensified, as both feared the power of each other's political ideologies and the threat of nuclear war. The U.S. general public was conditioned to view communism as a destructive menace, aiming to impose totalitarian rule all over the world. Soviet propaganda portrayed the West as governed by greedy imperialists who exploited workers. The two countries were the world's strongest nations, and their opposing ideas would extend to political and military conflicts. The American fear of communist expansion and the Soviet mistrust of relations resulted in an atmosphere of tension, suspicion, and paranoia between the nations. As a result, duck and cover drills and backyard bomb shelters were implemented in schools and homes across America in anticipation for nuclear attack. A solution was proposed to limit communism, containment. The plan was to have a long-term, patient but firm, and vigilant containment of Soviet expansive tendencies. George Kennan. This marked the first action of the Cold War, a geopolitical, ideological, and economic conflict between these two superpowers. As part of the containment strategy to control Soviet expansion, the U.S. proposed to increase research on atomic weapons. In 1945, American and Allied organizations worked to search Germany for research on military, scientific, and technological advancements in a mission known as Operation Paperclip. In doing this, they hired nearly 1,600 German scientists to help build America's collection of nuclear weaponry. Among those hired was Wernher von Braun, who would later become an important asset in the first American moon landing. Operation Paperclip was fueled by interest in becoming technologically dominant, notably with rocketry, and aided in creating a team of intelligence and preparation for the Cold War.
In the mid-1950s, space exploration became a major aspect of the U.S. and Soviet conflict. At the time, American citizens were still concerned over the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor and wanted to find a way to spy on the Soviets. The Soviet Union also wanted to monitor the U.S. to ensure their own safety, but their vastly overstated number of military and nuclear resources led them to reject the open skies policy proposal given by President Eisenhower, in which both nations could legally fly military observation aircraft over the other. In response to this rejection, Eisenhower announced that the U.S. would begin to construct a satellite for scientific purposes, although it would serve potential to prove dominance and gain intelligence on the Soviets. A week later, the Soviet Union followed suit. However, they effectively beat the U.S. by successfully launching Sputnik 1 into space. Although this action was supposedly scientific, both nations understood the potential of espionage satellites or launch missiles and viewed launches as an opportunity for expansion. Shortly after, Sputnik 2 was launched, sending the first animal into orbit. These Sputnik launches caused an extreme decline in confidence for American citizens, as both of their attempted launches had failed. This provoked the U.S. to prove themselves viable competitors to the Soviets, essentially triggering the space race. In response to Sputnik, the U.S. completely re-evaluated their funding of technological and scientific advancements. These actions were heavily fueled by the containment strategy, as the policy required action against any possible communist expansive movements. In 1958, the U.S. successfully launched their own satellite, Explorer 1, and created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to focus on the further exploration and military potential of space. The U.S. had begun taking action to exceed the launch of Sputnik. On the other hand, the Soviet Union jumped even further ahead in the space race by successfully sending a man into outer space. The Soviet space program had built the Vostok spacecraft and, after successful prototype launches, sent Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old cosmonaut, into space. The Soviets once again had made history by launching the first human into orbit around Earth. This increased the fear among the American people and escalated the conflict. It wasn't until May 5, 1961, that NASA met this achievement. 20 days later, President John F. Kennedy claimed that the U.S. would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
A year later, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a letter to President Kennedy congratulating him on putting an astronaut in orbit around the Earth. Kennedy saw an opportunity to propose cooperation between the two and sent a letter back to him. He received a positive response from the Soviet leader, but nothing significant was agreed upon. Each nation was still launching individual missions, and both criticized the engineering skills of each other. By 1963, relations between the Soviets and Americans had improved substantially. Multiple compromises regarding nuclear weapons had recently occurred, including the peaceful conclusion to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. A decreased American interest in space missions led Kennedy to propose a combined moon landing mission on September 20, 1963. Although the Soviet Union's foreign minister refused to comment on the idea, he referred to it as a good sign, marking the beginning of compromises in space. Meanwhile, NASA, led by von Braun, had already advanced further by fulfilling their promise from 1961. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong would become the first man to walk on the moon. The United States had won the race against the Soviet Union.
We're home. Man on the moon.
Listen,
Oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I'm going to step off the limb then.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Eventually, the two nations were able to resolve their differences and propose a possible docking of an American and Soviet spacecraft during 1971 meetings in Houston and Moscow. Finally, in April of 1972, the United States and the USSR signed an agreement concerning cooperation in exploration of use of outer space for peaceful purposes, establishing the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 and the official compromise to the space race conflict. As outside military expeditions came to an end and the U.S. was no longer engaged in war, relations further improved between the nations and the potential idea of a joint project was turning into a reality. After the Soviet-American agreement, the nations began work for Apollo-Soyuz, a test project in which spacecrafts from each nation would dock in space. In July 1975, a U.S. Apollo spacecraft carrying astronauts Thomas P. Stafford, Vance D. Brand, and Donald K. Slayton docked with the Russian Soyuz spacecraft with cosmonauts Alexei A. Leonov and Valery N. Kubasov. This project represented the nation's cooperation as both NASA and the USSR Space Agency would use joint research.
Joint groups were assigned to 5 general areas: communications and tracking, life support and crew transfer, mission planning, control and guidance, and mechanical design.
Their newly exercised collaboration would be used to create a universal docking system interface where the astronauts and cosmonauts work together to perform assignments. Upon successfully joining in space, the commanders from each spacecraft would greet each other with a notable handshake in space that formally symbolized the compromise to the space race conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. Apollo-Soyuz has left a lasting impact on both nations and led to several more advancements in science and technology in space. In fact, the collaboration has resulted in the agreement between Russia and the US to build the moon's first space station through the NASA program with Russian designs, which is part of an even longer project to be able to eventually send humans to Mars.
The head of the Strategic Defense Command became head of NASA's space program near Stanford. And he funded our Stanford engineering department to invite 4 Russians over to Stanford, and they came and they worked with us for 4 years designing a manned exploration of Mars using the Russian launchers and the U.S. technology and electronics and so forth.
Both Russia and the United States would cooperate to build systems necessary for missions in lunar orbit and to surface on the moon. They're even pondering over the possibility of various other countries to contribute work for the International Lunar Station. The fact that the space exploration has become a worldwide joint effort simply represents the monumental effect of this compromise.